Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
This is Gabe Lyons. Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. And today we are pulling out of the vault a great talk that took place just a few years ago by Soledad O'Brien. Now, many of you may have heard of Soledad O'Brien. She's a great documentarian, an award-winning journalist, a news anchor, producer, covers so many different topics and issues. And we invited Soledad in to give us a talk that would help us see through her perspective of covering so many different stories over the years of race in America, to catch us up. Now, this was a few years back, and we pulled it out of the archives because we felt like it did a great job of just helping us all step back and gaining better perspective. So let's listen in now.
Q is about conversations, and race is one of the most difficult and uncomfortable and messy but necessary conversations we can have. It is, I've been told many times, the third rail of conversations. And yet, here we are. It is difficult to advance good ideas about how to move forward in this country and around the globe when we have such a troubled racial history and a very strong reluctance to talk about it and confront it. But we're here today because we are brave, and we know that renewal comes about with work, not wishing. And restoration can't be based only on optimism, but actually on reality and honesty. Race does not exist. I am not trying to be clever or particularly provocative. Biologically speaking, genetically speaking, there is only one race, the human race. So how is it that something that doesn't exist or exists only as a social construct has caused wars and genocide and hatred and violence and division, and also brings people together and reflects culture and shared experience and community? I've been reporting on race in America and around the globe for nearly a decade, but my entire life I've been living it. My mother is black and my father's white, and they met in 1958 in Baltimore, Maryland. They met at church because they used to both attend daily mass. And on their first date, no restaurant would seat them together. And so they were turned away, restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, and my mother eventually took my father home and made him dinner. And later she would tell me and my three sisters, "See, girls, if you could cook, you could get a man." When they decided that they'd get married at the end of 1958, interracial marriage was illegal in the state where they lived, in Maryland. And so they left home, drove to Washington, D.C., and got hitched, and then came back and lived illegally as a married couple in Baltimore. And when their friends told them, well, don't have children. I'm one of 6, all of us named for Catholic saints. My parents were terrible at taking advice. But what they faced was real. They could not buy a home in the neighborhood where they wanted to live. They couldn't eat in restaurants. There were jobs and opportunities that were not available to my mother because she's black, and that held my father, in a way, in bondage too. And so even though race is a social construct, it had some very real and tangible effects. Our minds are predisposed, scientists tell us, to make generalizations about people. It's a fundamental fact in the psychological process. We essentialize people. We classify people as if they have some deeply shared properties. Princeton researcher named Sarah Leslie says that in children as young as 4 years old, the brain will work to group people as if they have a fundamental deep truth. Black people are essentially this. White people are essentially this. And our brain works to see us and them. And that, of course, sets the stage for stereotyping and for discrimination and racism. But even with that evolutionary disposition to see things as us, good and moral, and them, not so much, The concept of race is actually a relatively new thing in the United States. The idea of a racial phenotype being linked to a hierarchy is actually a modern-day obsession. Take a look at how the early explorers to Africa wrote about their experiences with Africans. From the 9th century, an explorer said this: "The king of Ghana is a great king. In his territories are mines of gold." The 11th century, still Ghana. "The king rules an enormous kingdom and has great power." 14th century of Mali in West Africa, an explorer wrote this: "Mali is the biggest, richest, and most powerful state in the world." But by the 17th century, the tone when describing Africans would change dramatically. Here's the great philosopher Immanuel Kant discussing something that seemed to be intelligent but had been uttered by an African. He said this: "This fellow was quite black from head to toe, a clear proof that what he said was stupid." Or Hugh Trevor Roper said this: "At present, there is little or no African history to teach. There is only the history of Europe in Africa." And Linnaeus, remember him from your 7th grade science class? He created that taxonomy that divided human beings into Homo sapiens, Europaeus, Asiaticus, Americanus, and Afar. It won't shock you, I'm sure, to know that Homo sapien Europaeus, the European man, was described as active and adventurous, and Homo sapien Afar was described as lazy and careless. So we must ask ourselves what exactly happened in that 3-century gap when we went from respective African kingdoms, they're amazing, to Africans, they're subhuman. The answer, of course, is colonization and slavery, and we reap that today. If you're American, you, of course, probably studied the first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. You know the settlers struggled, they nearly died, but by 1617, they found success with a crop, and that crop was tobacco, and it turned out to be a hardy crop that flourished and, most historically relevant, required lots of hard labor to harvest. And so for Europeans, the New World meant jobs and opportunities. A system of indentured servitude offered people who were willing to work for 4 to 7 years of labor. When they were done, they got corn and clothes and land. And white Europeans, many of them poor and unemployed, came to the New World in droves. And it might surprise you to know that historians say that black indentured servants and white indentured servants worked together in Jamestown under the roughly same terms. People thought not really in terms of color. Someone wouldn't say, "I'm white." They might say, "I'm an Englishman," or "I'm a nobleman." But they wouldn't say, "I'm white, he's black." But the mid-1600s would be a turning point. Indentured servants became problematic. They moved on, and in fact, they often became competition. And so slavery would become legally recognized. It was no longer just heathens who were enslaved, but anybody whose ancestors were heathens. It became a lifelong condition. It was passed down generation after generation. And the scholar George Fredrickson said this was the very moment, in fact, that race, not religion, became the justification for slavery. And in characterizing people by race and creating a hierarchy, white people are the master, black people are the slaves, that became the law of the land. And the way to justify the enslavement of other human beings, which was hard to do sometimes, was to say, literally, the Bible supports it, and also to create a narrative that blacks were not actually human beings. And if they weren't really human beings, then they really didn't have the capacity to live as free people, right? And if they lacked the properties that would entitle them to be free, then we weren't doing anything wrong. They're not like us. And it became a psychological necessity to think negatively of the people you were enslaving to justify the awful things that you were doing to them. This rationalization, based on what we casually call race, this phenotype, continued for centuries, and the vestiges of it continue to this day. It ushered in an American era that we rarely talk about, Reconstruction and Jim Crow and segregation, and what came with that, which was violence and domestic terror and exploitation. And we are uncomfortable discussing this part of our American history. 2 weeks ago, there was a new study that came out on lynching in America. It found that there were just under 4,000 cases of black people who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. It was domestic terrorism, a violent public spectacle with the goal of terrorizing black people and hunting them down and killing them. And we'd like to imagine that it was perpetrated by a lunatic fringe. A bunch of extremists did these terrible things. But history tells us that was not the case. An example, 1930, young black man in the American South, shot, hung, burned, castrated. His genitals and his fingers were cut and handed off, sold to people in the crowd. The crowd numbered in the thousands, and it was entertainment. People brought their children. And they smiled for the roving photographers who in turn sold postcards for 15 cents. It was a community celebration, and its point was to underscore racial domination. We do not like to confront our own horrors, but this is a legacy of race in America. Many people of all races like to think the history of race in America is something like this. There was slavery, it was bad. Lincoln freed the slaves, then Martin Luther King Jr. brought in civil rights, then Obama was elected, and it's all good. Not so much. It's a pleasant summary, but it actually skips the violence and the horror and the true telling of what actually happened. And we are here to have a conversation today. And we are not going to fear the truth of our own history. Because you cannot advance good if you don't confront bad. And you cannot seek renewal if you are not willing to dig into the uncomfortable truths about how we got here today. Today in America, we grapple with race. My most recent documentary for CNN took a look at the relationship between black people and the police. And our documentary happened to coincide with several high-profile killings by police of black men in Missouri and New York City and Ohio and elsewhere. And our documentary opened with the video of the choking death of Eric Garner. You'll remember he said, "I can't breathe." Happened in Staten Island. And we focused on the statistics that we knew about in stop and frisk policy in New York City. And one very disturbing statistic was that in a roughly 10-year period in New York, approximately 5 million people were stopped by police. 83% of them were black and Hispanic men. And 90%, that's 90%, were not found guilty of any crime. Not a felony, not a misdemeanor. They didn't get a ticket. 9 out of 10 people had done nothing. Our documentary profiled a young man named Keyshan who's been stopped 100 times, starting from when he was about 13 years old, and he describes the humiliation of being pushed up against a wall in search, a wall on his college campus as his classmates are walking by and his professors are walking by. What does it do to people to be considered a suspect constantly in their own neighborhood because of the color of their skin? Our history isn't black history, squeezed into the shortest month of the year. It's American history, and it's got its amazing narratives, and it's got its inspirational moments, and it has its very ugly parts. And we need to confront them and dissect them and consider the implications of them as we wrestle with the challenges of racial conflict in modern-day America. Brain science gives us hope. Researchers tell us we can override how our brain works. We can trick our brain into breaking those us and them associations, and that's great news. And my belief in human beings gives me great hope. My mother used to tell me the story of walking in Baltimore with my 2 older sisters in the early 1960s. They were toddlers. And I asked her, so what was it like to live in a city where your marriage was illegal and your children were considered to be genetically inferior? People used to spit on us, she said. Oh my goodness. What did you do? I asked her. And her answer stuck with me forever. She said, we knew America was better than that. And by extension, that meant she was there to be part of constructive change. True optimism, I think, is knowing that there is an American ideal that all men are created equal. But when that line was drafted into the Declaration of Independence, many members of Congress held slaves, and the hypocrisy was pointed out even at that time in 1776. But they were stating an ideal of what it meant, what it could mean to be an American. We cannot advance without honest conversations about our shared American history. What will bring renewal is digging into those tougher moments in history and having the courage to learn our own story so we can be better and we can do better. Thank you for being part of that conversation.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Soledad O'Brien. I know her voice is probably quite familiar, but to hear her take on these topics and help us just gain some perspective, I thought a couple of the quotes that just stood out to me. One, she says, "Our minds are predisposed," scientists tell us, "to make generalizations about people." How important is that to just remember that every individual is made uniquely in the image of God? No two people are the same, but in our own ways, we tend to try to generalize, to try to make one person's story everybody's story. It simply isn't true. She also says this: "You cannot advance good if you don't confront bad, and you cannot seek renewal if you're not willing to dig into the uncomfortable truth about how we got here today." I think that just captures so much of what these last few years of conversations have been about in American life and American culture, is taking a good look at the past and a reckoning taking place that discovers and exposes things that were true, that maybe were covered up, were never told, the stories that we never heard. And then we start to hear them, and we have to grapple with them, and we have to wrestle with, now, what does that mean? What has that caused? What are the wounds that have erupted because of it? And so I'm grateful for talks like this. I'm grateful for moments like this, for months like this, where we take a moment out and we do have to reckon with our past. We do have to recognize how far we've come, but also how much further we have to go. And so I hope this encourages you today as you continue forward in your relationships, your friendships, that we'll all look at those that we come into contact with who are different than us, and we will see that as a gift, not as a generalization, but as a unique contribution and gift from God to our world and to our communities. I hope you have a wonderful week.